disallowance. Now, it was moved pro forma on the 25th of May on the motion of the Honourable Rick Mazza that the Firearms Amendment Regulations 2017, published in the Gazette on the 3rd of February 2017 and tabled in the Legislative Council on the 17th of May 2017 under the Firearms Act 1973, be and are hereby disallowed. So the question is that the regulations be disallowed, or the question probably is that that motion be agreed to. The Honourable Rick Mazza.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President, and I'm very pleased that we've got a bit of a start before the tea break, because I know that we're on a very tight schedule to get this motion put today. Members, look, it's not lightly that we look at disallowance motions on regulations as they come through. However, in this case, I think it's very important that this House discusses the issue of the regulations that have been put through, the Firearms Amendment Regulations 2017. Now, effectively what those regulations do is they recategorise lever-action shotguns from Category A, and Category A being the lowest test category for firearms, to Category B and Category D. Now, Category B is a slightly higher test where you need to be able to prove genuine need, and most firearm owners will live with that. You know, it's attainable, and it's one of those things where they could live with a recategorisation to B. However, a recategorisation to D is in the same category as military assault rifles, and it's not a category that any legitimate firearm owner would be able to access. Now, the difference between the two categories is that a lever-action shotgun with a magazine capacity of 5 or less is in Category B, and a lever-action shotgun with a magazine capacity greater than 5 rounds will go into Category D. Now, the information that I've got is that the reason that this recategorisation came into being is because of some changes to the National Firearms Agreement. Now, those changes in the NFA came about because it was a response to the Martin Place siege, and there was a letter from the Honourable Michael Keenan MP, Minister for Justice and Minister adjusting the Prime Minister on counter-terrorism, that was addressed to a previous member of the other place. And in that letter, a response to obviously an inquiry, it says, in January of this year, the Martin Place siege review recommended that the Commonwealth, States and Territories simplify the regulation of legal firearms market through an update of the technical elements of the NFA. Now, members, my concern with that is that a lever-action shotgun was not the weapon that was used in Martin Place. The siege at Martin Place, there was a pump-action, sawn-off pump-action shotgun used in that instance, a completely different mechanism to a lever-action. Now, a lever-action firearm has been around since the 1880s. Anybody that likes watching old Western movies would see lever-actions. And there's many firearms and many configurations and calibers in a lever-action. So why shotguns in this case that a lever-action have been singled out, I'm not quite sure. I don't buy the Martin Place siege argument. So we have a situation now where if you have a 5-shot magazine lever-action shotgun, that's in Category A, the briefing we had said that those people would be granted a Category B firearms licence for that particular shotgun. For the few shotguns that have a magazine capacity over 5 rounds, those licence holders will be granted a grandfather clause of being able to have a Category D licence for that particular firearm for the life of their licence or their ownership. Now, there's been a lot of discussion last term surrounding firearms. We did actually have a few things go on in that term. 2 of those were disallowance motions on fee increases, some dramatic fee increases the first time round, up to 140%. Reason given that was cost recovery. The disallowance motion I moved on the first time was supported by the Labor Party. And in a very rare instance, a member of the Liberal Party crossed the floor to support it, the Honourable Simon O'Brien. The Honourable Simon O'Brien pointed out that it was quite a clunky system and there's some issues involved there. The second time around, there was a modest increase in firearm fees, and again the ALP supported the motion. And again, a member of the Liberal Party crossed the floor, the Honourable Robin McSweeney. So there has been concern amongst constituents in relation to some of the matters surrounding where firearms management and law-abiding firearms owners have been disadvantaged. Now, following those disallowance motions, there was an inquiry by the Joint Committee on Delegated Legislation, and I think the Honourable Robin Chappell was the chair of that particular committee at the time. And they looked into whether the increase in charges was cost recovery. The short answer was they came back and did find it was cost recovery. It had been supported. However, I think some comments were that we did have a very clunky, inefficient system, so even though it was cost recovery, that there could be improvements made. So that led to the Attorney-General at the time arranging or forming an inquiry by the Law Reform Commission, Inquiry 105. Now, that inquiry...
Order. Members, noting the time, I shall leave the chair until the ringing of the bells.
Eh?
Just get into the good stuff.
Yeah. Based on the Link Cafe siege, actually had no correlation to the type of firearm that was used at Link Cafe. I also covered the fact that we had two disallowance motions on fees in the last term of government, and that an inquiry had been held by the Delegated Legislation Committee. In the executive summary of that report, the committee resolved to advise the House of 4 controversial matters arising from the hearing and those submissions. The matters are: 1, the processing of application for firearm licences; 2, the opportunity for error in such processing; 3, the noting fee for additional firearms on certain existing licences; and 4, the cost of licences in other jurisdictions. So, members, there was quite a bit of debate last term, and as I mentioned before the break, there's also the formation of the Law Reform Commission Report 105. Now, I'll have to jump around a little bit to give this context, but the Law Reform Commission undertook a 2-year inquiry, a very expansive inquiry. They took something like 1,244 submissions, and in fact, in their report, in the foreword, they did say that the response included 1,244 written submissions, and it was one of the largest, if not the largest, response that the Commission has ever received on one of its referrals. So it had a lot of community interest. It went on to say that a lot of those submissions were quite detailed, and there was obviously a lot of input that had gone into it. So, members, the Law Reform Commission did undertake a very extensive review. It took a lot of evidence, and I think it's a very thorough and very balanced report that came out of it. As part of that review, the Law Reform Commission also had a discussion paper. I think it's very important as part of this motion that we do cover some of that. And look, I will abridge it because I know that we've got limited time today. So on page 19 of that discussion paper, there's a paragraph in there that says that although safety, the community of the safety is concerned to prevent harm, and that's the major reason, major object of a review, it does say, however, community safety is not the only relevant consideration. Firearms are also capable of being used for many entirely legitimate purposes, such as being enjoyed for their historical value as collector's items, shooting at targets in sport, or serving as essential tools of trade in the agricultural sector and in pest management, ensuring that people may obtain and use firearms for purposes such as farming, sport, hunting, pest control and collection are legitimate aims of legislation, such as the Firearms Act, just as harm minimisation is also a legitimate aim. So the Law Reform Commission did see in its discussion paper that there had to be some balance between public safety and the ability for people to be able to use firearms legitimately in Western Australia. Now, in the briefing that I had earlier in the week, it was suggested to me that one of the reasons that these regulations were gazetted was because those conditions are now in the National Firearms Agreement, and they had to comply with it because it was a COAG agreement. Well, members, a letter from the Honourable Michael Keenan to one of the stakeholder groups said that irrespective of the language used in the updated agreement is not legally binding upon jurisdictions. It remains up to the states and territories to determine how they will regulate firearms in accordance with the updated agreement. So it is up to each state to decide with their Firearms Acts what part of the NFA they will use. And look, Firearms Acts around Australia actually vary quite greatly depending on which state you're in. So we do not, in this state, need to comply with the NFA if it doesn't suit us. And what I'm saying here is this recategorisation of lever-action firearms for 2 rounds, basically going from 5 to 7, will have no public safety benefit. It's just another impost on legitimate firearm owners. In fact, even in the Law Reform Commission report, they have stated that it's noteworthy that Australian jurisdictions, including Western Australia, have not implemented every item in the National Firearms Agreement. It is clearly not enough, therefore, to say that a particular item ought to be in the Firearms Act because it is in each of the National Firearms Agreements. So Western Australia does not have to adopt these regulations. We have to make that very clear. Now, getting back to the disallowance motions we had in the past and the setting up of this Law Reform Commission inquiry and final report. As part of that process, there was also issues surrounding the clunkiness and the inefficiency of the licensing system that we had in Western Australia. So through estimate questioning, there was promises of a new computer processing system within Western Australia that would take care of security agents or security officers and also pawnbrokers, but predominantly used for firearm processing. And a lot of that was surrounding the cost recovery fees that were being charged in Western Australia, which are significantly higher than many other jurisdictions within Australia. Now, finally, that system got implemented at some millions of dollars. Members, I have to tell you, it is no cheaper. In fact, I know the Honourable Aaron Stonehouse has got a disallowance motion on a further increase in fees. It is no more efficient. My office continually gets complaints about the processing times that are being taken to process firearm applications. It is no more accurate. I'm constantly getting complaints that firearm licence renewals are coming back with conditions on them, where there were no conditions in the past. And if there's a number of firearms on, the conditions vary greatly, even though someone might have a firearms licence which is a no-conditions licence. So the new system is actually not performing that well. During the inquiry by the Joint Standing Committee on Delegated Legislation, it was also identified that part of the reason why we had this very clunky, expensive and inefficient system was things like people have to download a form from the internet, fill out that form, or actually fill that form out online, download it, sign it, then go into Australia Post, and Australia Post would then process the application, upload it onto their computer. Sometime in the future, that would then get sent to the firearm licensing branch. But their computer didn't interact with the Australia Post computer, so they had to manually load everything back onto the computer, which is a complete, in this day and age, I see as a complete waste of time and would drive up costs. Now, in the briefing I had the other day, when I mentioned the fact that the new system had some bugs in it, it was suggested to me that they were still doing manual workarounds with this new system, which has been in place for some time. So it suggests the new system has a number of flaws, and maybe the millions of dollars that have been spent on that system have been a bad investment for the state.
Would you take a minute?
Sure.
How does the system work in the rest of Australia?
Well, that's a very good question, Honourable Colin Ticknell, and I do take that interjection. In other states of Australia, as I understand it, most of those are directly online. So people can apply direct to the Police Licensing Division for their applications. In Victoria, my understanding is an addition could be 48 hours to have that addition in place. And of course, here, where an addition is $173, I think is the latest figure. My last investigation to Victoria was about $9.20, so there's a significant difference in the application fees. Now, unfortunately, members, when it comes to firearms, there is a community attitude out there that, you know, firearms are bad and anything to do with firearms, really, if there's more restrictions, well, that's better. Well, members, the unfortunate thing with that is that licensed legitimate firearm owners, very, very rarely is there an incident with a licensed firearm owner and a licensed firearm. Almost never. If there's an issue, it's an illicit firearm with someone who maybe has some sort of criminal background, but very rarely a legitimate firearm owner. Yet, there is so much pressure and impost put on to licensed firearm owners that it makes no sense when it comes to public safety. There was a Senate inquiry, I think it was tabled in 2015, the ability of Australian law enforcement authorities to eliminate gun-related violence in the community. That inquiry said that they estimate there's 260,000 illicit firearms in Australia, but they admitted it was unknown because, of course, they aren't registered, so I don't know how they count them. It's estimated in Western Australia there's 26,000 illicit firearms. Now, that's where I think the focus should be. If we are having problems with firearms in the community, and I did watch the news this morning and I did see that there'd been another drive-by shooting in our northern suburbs, I think it was northern suburbs. But this is the work of criminals. This isn't legitimate people. This is the work of criminals, and this is the work of illicit firearms. Now, of that 26,000 illicit firearms in this state, there's always been some indication that maybe it comes from stolen firearms that started off legitimately. Well, there's about 400 odd firearms stolen each year. Now, one firearm stolen is one too many, but generally these are long-arm hunting rifles, and the police had said to me that, that they don't really find them used in crimes very often. They're not the gun of choice for criminals. So the illicit market can be supplied through porous borders or the manufacture of illicit firearms. In fact, there has been cases on the East Coast where, I think in one case there was a jeweller who was making very high-grade machine guns that he was selling. So they can enter the market, and that's where the focus needs to be if you want to look at public safety, not on responsible law-abiding firearm owners. Now, let's find my place here, members, if you give me a moment. Now, my understanding is that Queensland and Victoria are yet to implement any regulations to recategorise shotguns. The other thing too with these regulations, it doesn't distinguish between the type of shotgun, whether it's a 410, a 20 gauge or a 12 gauge. It's actually silent on that issue. So I don't know whether small bore 410s get caught up in this regulation. It would appear that they probably do. And I think this is quite a big impost on legitimate firearm ownership. Now, we were supposed to see a more efficient system. The Law Reform Commission report also spoke about a reduction of red tape. So Law Reform Commission said that an understanding that most crimes involving firearms are carried out by people who are not licensed to carry firearms And then another dot point, a streamlined firearms registration process and a reduction of unnecessary red tape. Now, it would make sense to me that if we had a new system and it was a good system, we should have a reduction in red tape. Well, members, I can tell you over the last couple of years, what's actually occurred is that there has been issues surrounding transport of firearms. I don't know whether any of your officers have maybe received some of these complaints, but particularly small dealers are finding that they can't get supply of firearms. The police licensing services have put a number of conditions, recently have put a number of conditions on carriers of firearms. This has only come in the last couple of years. So prior to that, Australia Post could transport firearms, other commercial carriers could transport firearms, so people that lived in Merredin or Southern Cross or Kalgoorlie and those places could get supply and stock to their firearm dealerships. Now, generally these firearm dealers are just small family businesses. They're making a living from a small business. They have all of the challenges that other small businesses have. They're employing people, they're paying their leases and trying to make a living in their firearm dealership. However, in recent times, they are struggling. They just simply can't get supply. In fact, some people are driving from places like Narrogin into Perth to be able to get their firearms and ammunition. As I understand it, there is 11 accredited carriers under the new accreditation system. A lot of those carriers don't go to more remote areas where firearms are needed for farmers who may need to use it for pest control or the destruction of stock. A lot of these couriers aren't taking new accounts, or a lot of these transport companies charge an account keeping fee which are prohibitive. I had some calls last week regarding the fact that Australia Post can no longer transport firearms, so any dealer who wishes to transport a firearm to the East Coast can't do it through Australia Post. That's also the case where in the past ammunition might be sent to a remote area for a landholder or a primary producer to use. They can't get that anymore either. And a lot of the regions, mining pastoral, southwest, or the agricultural region, not only are firearms used as a tool of trade for primary producers, but a lot of people in those areas use firearms for recreation, whether that be clay target shooting, rifle shooting, bench rest, whatever the case is, it is a big social sporting activity in rural Western Australia. Now, those people have been impacted greatly by this limitation on the ability to be able to transport firearms, and many of them are basically saying, well, we're getting to the point we're going to have to close up shop. So that's one impost of red tape that's been put onto firearm owners, and there hasn't been an incident that actually has initiated these changes. In addition to that, there has also been a requirement now, a policy that's been put out by the licensing department that firearm dealers now have to upgrade their security. And some of the requirements of that upgrade of security on handguns, this is quite onerous. So a lot of the small dealers are saying, well, we just can't afford to upgrade our security to this level. Or a lot of remote dealers are saying, well, we can't comply, because if you want monitored alarms and those sorts of things, it's not available where we are. So this blanket security arrangement hasn't been tailored for different situations for firearm dealers around the state, where firearms may be needed more in the region. So there's a lot of work to be done around this area, members. I did speak to the Minister for Police. She has said to me that she's going to try and discuss getting an extension of when these security arrangements need to come in, and maybe try and look at some way of tailoring it more for those people who are out in the regions who may not be able to comply, or the cost is prohibitive considering that they might be a small dealer. So I wait with interest to see how that plays out. Some of the other things around these requirements too, there is a firearms collector. In fact, I think he opens it to the public. It's like a museum, Dr. Leo Layden. And Dr. Leo Layden was in the Saturdays West on Inside Cover, where he has to now start to dispose of his collection that he's had over a very long time, and that he has been very passionate about and has opened to the public. A lot of antique collectors type items that he has to sell. In fact, I think there was an auction last night or even tonight where he's starting to get rid of some of this stuff. And he has said a lot of it is because of these new security arrangements. It's going to cost him $15,000 he doesn't have. So he's in the process of getting rid of that. And just to digress slightly on that, members, Elston, I think, is a great cartoonist. I get a lot of humour, particularly in Saturday's West, with the portrayal of the Liberal Party. He does capture things very well, and I have a lot of respect for his artwork. However, on the inside cover on Saturday, I have to say that I thought it was a bit of bad taste. So there was a cartoon there with, I assume, Leo Layden, Dr. Leo Layden, in a chair, smoking his pipe with a fire in the background, and he's got a row of trophy heads on the wall with some guns, and the head of his wife, who passed away last year. So I thought that was particularly bad taste. I did ring and my office spoke to Dr. Leo Layden. He just dismissed it. But I think in circumstances like that, where someone's had a recently departed person, it was a bit off. Anyway, members, noting the time, I know that we have other speakers and we must deal with this today. I will wrap up in saying that I think that these regulations are ineffective when it comes to public safety. There are a lot of issues within the Law Reform Commission report that I think need to be implemented. We do need a review of the Act. I was at SSAA, or Sporting Shooters Association of Western Australia, AGM a few weeks ago. I addressed that AGM. There was a couple of hundred people there. The Minister for Police, the Honourable Michelle Roberts, also attended and spoke to those members, and some of the comments she made were very encouraging about getting some of these things over the line. But I have to say, members, these are just everyday people going about their daily business, enjoying their sport, that are being marginalised, being pushed with red tape, and having things like these regulations that actually do nothing for public safety but put a greater impost for no good reason onto these people is wrong. So, members, I commend this motion to the House. I hope that members can see that this is a very worthy disallowance motion, and I'm very hopeful that members will support it.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.